I promise, Jan, I'm not going to report you for starting a few minutes early. Of course, we remember this a little different. I remember Jan asking me if I would speak. And when she told me everybody else that she had invited, all the other luminaries, and that I'd be one of the last people to speak, I said, wow, I'm in deep trouble, you know, following Marge and Elsa and Nara, and just, you know, it's like, and Hallie, oh my gosh, really bad. But, you know, it seemed to me that this title would get everybody's attention, because you all remember the very silly 1998 romantic comedy, There's Something About Mary, that had, you know, Cameron Diaz and Matt Dillon and Ben Stiller, and I figured, well, these people will show up. And then I used a trick from my journalist days as editor of CNN, a young reporter, and I did some investigative reporting. So you've all heard that Mary is one of the few people in the history of ACS who has been both the chair of the board and a president. And you know she was the first woman chair in 78 and 80, and you heard the story. And having been on the board of directors, I can imagine how that could happen. And she was, of course, the second woman president in 1987. So I asked Christy Pearson, who works for the Secretary's office, and Marlene Widener in my office, to do a little, you know, get a list of all the committees that Mary's been on for the last 30 years. And I went through, and I looked at all the names, and of course I had to rule out the people who were dead. I'm not into seances. And I contacted about 20 people who I asked 5 questions. And I want to say I got 20 responses, so I'm pretty impressed with that. So I guess that's the space bar. So here were the questions. When did you first meet Mary, and what was your impression of her? What is your fondest or strongest memory of Mary? What was the most important contribution Mary made during her long service to ACS? What are the 3 adjectives that best describe Mary? Is there something about Mary that you would like people to know? So there were my questions, and it's my honor this afternoon to share with you the remembrances of 20 people, some of whom are in this room, who themselves are role models and exceptional ACS members and volunteers. And I'm going to show a series of photographs of Mary that show her during the years. These come from the CNN archives, and I again thank Marlene Widener, who's in this audience. Each slide is randomly sprinkled with the adjectives that people provided. Now, I thought, you ask people, give me 3 adjectives. I figured 20 people, I'd have probably 7 adjectives. Oh no. There were like 30 adjectives, and I didn't really actually know that there were so many ways to say awesome, but you are about to find out. So let me start with some recollections of Mary. This is a let's see, I think I have to do some clicking here. Okay. I'm going to start with a recollection from J. Michael Fitzpatrick, who rose to become the president and chief operating officer of Roman Haas. And this story, I am really indebted to Jim Burke, a former chair of the board, for in his recollection, he told me something about Mike Fitzpatrick. And I thought, well, Mike wasn't on my list, but I'm going to talk to him. And what Jim remembered was that Mike was the product of a working-class family in New Orleans and had attended a local Jesuit preparatory high school. And according to Jim, Mike was, quote, bright but unfocused about career options. Well, all that changed, as Mike recalls. This is what he told me. It was September 1964, and, quote, meeting Professor Good hardly describes the encounter. Mike was in his freshman year at the University of New Orleans and was enrolled as a civil engineering major. Mary taught his freshman chemistry class. When she walked into the first lecture, he says, she imposed a commanding presence on the room. She was a great teacher, but at the same time, her no-nonsense style made it immediately clear that the semester was going to be all work and no play. Mike says, Mary had a huge impact on me that semester, and by the end of the course, I had decided to change my major to chemistry. Throughout my time as a student there, Mary's forceful leading role in the chemistry department was a part of my education. I also took courses with her husband, Bill, a professor in the physics department. Well, he went on to earn his degree. He was a star student of Bob Stevens at Rice University. He took his postdoc with E.J. Corey at Harvard. He joined Roman Haas as a research chemist, and his meteoric career went from there. 30 years after graduating from college, Mike attended a symposium at which Mary delivered a talk on new product innovation. After the talk, Mike went up to her and introduced himself. "Hello, Dr. Good. I'm Mike Fitzpatrick, one of your former students. I thought you might like to see how one of your new products turned out." She immediately remembered Mike recounting facts from his graduate work at Rice and postdoc at Harvard. Mike says, "After that, Mary and I remained in contact with each other, and I even worked up enough nerve to call her Mary instead of Professor Good. But in my mind, she will always be the Professor Good that helped shape me. Mary is the reason I became a chemist." Jim Burke says that when Mary talked about Mike to him, it was with great pride, but her satisfaction lay entirely in what Mike had done for himself. According to Jim, her satisfaction lay in being there to help him get started. Although this recollection is from only one of Mary's students, there are dozens more who would undoubtedly say the same thing. Laura Powell is another eminent chemist who says she owes much to Mary. When Mary was president-elect in 1986, Laura was a new ACS counselor. In a moment of pure bravado, Laura picked Budget and Finance as the committee on which she wanted to be. So she was in the hotel, she wrote a letter to Mary on the hotel stationery, and she said, "I would like to be on BNF." And Laura says, well, we all know how the politics work. I mean, now, it goes through conch and all sorts of other things, but she said she would have been really excited if she had been chosen as an associate. And instead, she got an appointment letter, and she was appointed as a full member of BNF. So she goes to her first meeting, and she says, no one knew who she was. And the committee immediately went into executive session, and when she stayed, they tactfully tried to get her to leave. But when she didn't leave, Frank Young, who was at that time the ACS chief financial officer, came over and gently asked who she was. And as Laura says, I really appreciated the confidence that Mary had in me, because that opportunity ultimately had a great impact on my career. It was an opportunity to learn how to operate in a high-level formal committee structure and get the job done, but it was an opportunity to work with many people with much greater experience and stature. I believe that my experiences in ACS have definitely been a positive impact on my career, just like it was for Mary, who pointed her to her experience as chair of BNF when she was being considered for a senior position in Allied Signal. And Laura also remembers that she worked with you, Mary, when she was director of the Advanced Technology Program at the Commerce Department when you were Undersecretary of Technology. And Mary also was a reference for her when she applied for and eventually got the job as director of Pacific Northwest Laboratory. So I think there's a number of other things we can say about Mary. But many other fabulous things happened to Laura, and here's what she says. Would all of these things have happened if Mary hadn't springboarded my career with that appointment many years ago? Well, maybe yes, maybe no. But I truly believe that my career would likely have taken a different turn without her. Over the years, I have from time to time connected with Mary for advice, and she has always been very generous with her time. There is truly something about Mary. She is an amazing, caring, inspirational role model, and I will always be in her debt. And I will say that this is how I feel about Mary. Laura expressed it absolutely perfectly, so I didn't have to. 7 chemists who ultimately became ACS presidents remember Mary with tremendous affection and clarity, and now I'm going to tell you some of the things they said. This is not Al Heininger. I don't even know who this is. Mary, maybe you recognize him, but my first recollection is from Al. And everyone said, is that Al when he was young? And I said, no, I have no idea who it is. The photo was only marked, you were getting an award here from ACS. And I think it might have been the Garvin Medal, but maybe it'll come back to you. And in any event, Al Heininger met Mary at an ACS meeting in Dallas when he was considering running for ACS president-elect. And Al recalls, Al sitting right over here with Margot, she impressed me with the combination of an industrial and academic background. The combination gave her a better understanding of what chemistry was all about. And Al, like many of us, always found Mary to be a reliable source and as knowledgeable about the complexities of ACS and the chemical enterprise as anyone he's ever met. Now, Jim Burke, who was a former chair of the board, said that Mary had a special way of listening to people. Without disengaging at all from the group, Mary would focus intently on the speaker as if that person were the only other one in the world. She listened attentively to ensure she grasped everything the other was trying to say before she began to reply. She listened patiently and respectfully to all, whether or not she agreed with their opinions. We live in an environment where it is commonplace for people to listen principally with the intention of correcting, criticizing, or refuting others, Jim says. Of all the communicating skills, listening appreciatively is, in my judgment, the most difficult of all to master. Mary showed us how it is done. And then I think many of you know Paul Anderson. He first met Mary for the first time when he introduced her as the priestly medalist. So that's not so many years ago. But Paul was nervous, and Mary calmed him down. But mostly Paul was impressed with Mary's personal and problem-solving skills. This is what Paul says. Mary is very direct, and you heard that from Hallie. So you don't have to hang around trying to figure out what she is thinking. That is the problem of why she is a good problem solver. And now, speaking of Mary's penchant for being direct, this is kind of a Hallie Merrill story. I think it may even be true. One staff member recalls making a presentation at a meeting on a highly sensitive subject. That staff member was Chief Financial Officer Frank Young, who I've mentioned before. He was very nervous about addressing this subject because he knew that the executive director at that time was very uneasy with the subject, and he also knew that the other people present in the meeting didn't completely understand it. And so, after letting it all hang out, I waited for what seemed to be an eternity for reaction. I mean, Frank laid out this problem that he knew was not going to be greeted well. And he waited, and he waited. And then Mary blurted out, "Frank's damn right. Why haven't we addressed this topic before?" So Frank says, needless to say, she was my best friend that day and for many years after. Frank also liked having a beer with Mary, and he appreciated that she drank it straight from the bottle. So he remembers sitting around doing that. Okay, just a few little sides here. And we have a really nice remembrance from Bill Carroll, who calls Mary the complete package. As a relative newcomer to ACS governance, Bill says, Mary didn't have to give me the time of day. In fact, I was sure she didn't have any idea who I was, but she was always polite, respectful, and willing to help. And then Helen Free. Helen Free, who's sitting right here. Helen Free met Mary many years ago and worked to get her elected as ACS president. And here's what she had to say. Southern lady as she is, gloating is not her style. But she politely let everyone know her opinion, backed by data, of course. Mary's special gift was to show us chemists that we could and did accomplish great things if we would all work together toward a common goal instead of pitting academia and industry and government against each other. And by her own example, she showed us that good chemistry is everywhere. And Paul Walter, also a former president who also served as chair of the board, remembers Mary as the only bright light in what was otherwise a miserable meeting in Philadelphia in the 1970s. Paul, then some of you who were at that meeting must know what that's about. I didn't. I couldn't find out from Paul what he meant, but I'm sure there's a story here. Paul was an associate on the Meetings and Exposition Committee in 1977, and Mary always came to M&E, and that always really impressed him. Mary named Paul to be the chair of BNF, and he had his revenge when he was board chair by asking her to chair international activities, which needed strong leadership, and she provided it. In fact, Mary has always been willing to reach out to the chemical community worldwide, and this was evidenced by your early visit to Russia just as the Soviet Union was breaking up, her participating in the first international meeting of major chemical societies at Ascot, England in 1999, and her support as IAC chair of numerous projects to enhance scientific growth in Africa and Latin America. And then past President Ed Wasserman met Mary in the early 1970s when they served on a committee to evaluate doctoral programs in Texas. He says Mary had a focus and maturity given to few at any age. He greatly admired her ability to pioneer in activities in the chemical world where women were rarely found, but her performance exhibited leadership of rare quality. He says that was independent of gender. And Gordon Nelson says, and he, as you know, there was Mary ran against Gordon Nelson, but Gordon Nelson says this: you can be on different sides of a question, but she is always collegial. That is certainly getting rare these days. She is clearly a person who will make things happen. And of course, as we've heard, making things happen is one of the hallmarks of Mary. And I think, I heard from a lot of other people, staff people, and you heard from Hallie. That's true. So I'm going to tell you a little story from John Malin, who's sitting over here. John Malin was a staff person, and he first married. Now this is interesting because you have to listen to this. He first met Mary at a Gordon Research Conference in inorganic chemistry in the 1970s. We're talking like 40 years ago at the New Hampton School in New Hampshire. He was impressed by her very straightforward, direct style in elucidating science. She gave an insightful talk on Mossbauer spectroscopy of organometallic iron complexes related to the idea of using such compounds as catalysts. Mary spoke further about catalysis by ruthenium complexes, a particularly new area at the time. What an impression, Mary, you made on John, that 40 years later he recalls this talk and this topic as if it were yesterday. And certainly she is visionary. Special assistant to then Executive Director Joe Clark got to know Mary in 1980 when she was on the National Science Board and he was on the staff of President Carter's White House Science Office. One of his portfolios was National Science Foundation involvement in technology transfer during those days when government involvement beyond pure science was hotly debated. Mary was a wonderfully reasonable voice, both because of her knowledge of the government and academe, as well as her industrial experience, according to Joe. Her straightforward, common-sense comments were highly respected and influential on both sides of that debate. In short, my first impression was warmth atop extraordinary insight and ability to cut through the BS. So here are just a few more things, Mary, that your colleagues and friends would like like people to know. Mary enjoys trout fishing. A colleague once reached her on a cell phone while she was wading in the River Tweed in Scotland. She's knowledgeable about art, which is not surprising, since she was married to an artist. Mary once gave Joe Clark an instructive personal tour of the artist gathering on Montmartre Hill. The pieces he bought that day still hang in his bedroom. And on that same trip to Paris, Joe arranged a visit for you to Marie Curie's labs, and I know this is one of the highlights of your memories of Paris. Mary has the ability to cut across generations, and I show her here receiving a Kenti cloth from the National Organization for the Professional Advancement of Black Chemists and Chemical Engineers, and to make people feel respected and valued. She insisted that ACS be a much more gender-blind organization and remove bias whenever possible. She continues to be one of the most amazing role models for women chemists, and it's due to the sheer breadth of her career accomplishments, her accomplishments that you've heard about across industry, academia, government, and public service, as well as the enormous leadership capabilities that make you such a great role model and such a great mentor for everybody. I think that, this strong interest in people, I think every one of us has had this same feeling that Mike Fitzpatrick had, where you could call Mary up and ask her for advice. You always knew she would be there and she would give you advice, good, straightforward, no BS kind of advice. And she still does. And this is kind of what Mike says about her. Mary was successful at every stage of her career because she cares. She cares for the institution she's been a part of, the science she's championed and taught, and the society she has so ably led and represented. Most of all, she cares for the people around her. So in the minds of many people, and this is my favorite picture, I love this, but especially Paul Walter, who, of course, as I mentioned, is, like Mary, one of the few people to be both the chair of the board and to be president. Mary, and it speaks right to what Hallie said, Mary is the single most important living member of the American Chemical Society, and maybe the most important member we've had. He says, we have been extremely fortunate to have Mary. For the sake of the society, I'd say these words to you. 100 lat. In Polish, loosely translated, that means, may you live 100 years. It's also the part of a happy birthday song that they sing in Poland, but I did a little extra work on this with some of the Polish people on my staff to make sure I was saying the right thing. So in closing, I think we can all see there is something about Mary, and I tried to share the views of the people who remember you so much for so many things. There's a lot more that I could say, but I personally want to say that I value our friendship. The many times we've had breakfast or lunch or dinner together, your visit to our house where you saw my husband's art, and we had a nice scotch, as I recall, which is, it's really good. So to you I say stolat, and I've got to also thank the many, many people who were wonderful about taking the time to answer these 5 questions. I had 100% response rate, which is unheard of, but it says so much about everyone wanted a little piece of this action. And I must thank Christy Pearson again and Marlene Weiner, but also special thanks to Simanko Staley, who's sitting here and who's pretending like she's not here. Simanko is Callie's right. It helps to have a great special assistant. After we got all these photographs and all this text together, Simanko put this together into what I think is just a lovely slideshow. So Mary, it's my privilege to have been here, and Jan, thank you for whatever the way it worked. I either asked or you said, would you do it? It's the end result is I'm so pleased to be here. Thank you.